The river whispered as it slid past the willows, its waters carrying the weight of broken promises. On the southern bank, a girl no older than 14 sat with her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her dark braids heavy with river mist. Her name was Aiyana, meaning eternal blossom, but today her spirit was wilted and torn. Her father stood nearby, counting the sharp-edged tools piled in the dirt. Blades, flint, and woven baskets, while the traders from the far camp loaded their canoes. Aiyana's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had always been told she was the pride of her people, the daughter of a proud hunter and a mother who had once sung to the stars. But pride weighed nothing against a harsh winter and an empty food store. When the strangers came offering supplies, her father hesitated for only a moment before nodding. In that blink, Aiyana's fate was sealed. No ceremony, no farewell, just a hard shove toward a foreign canoe, her bare feet slipping on the mud, her cries swallowed by the relentless river wind. Across the clearing, hidden among the cottonwoods, a boy watched. His name was Takoda, meaning friend to all, but his loyalty ran deeper than any title. He had grown beside Aiyana like two shoots of the same tree, laughing in the summers, weaving dream catchers in the fall, and promising in whispers that they would always protect each other. Now, every instinct in him screamed against the injustice unfolding before his eyes. Takoda tightened his fists, his young heart blazing with a fury he had never known. But he could not act yet. The river was wide and swift, the traders cruel and armed. To charge forward now would be to lose not just Aiyana, but his own life. He needed a plan. He needed the right moment. As the canoes pushed away from the shore, carrying Aiyana into the unknown, Takoda slipped silently through the trees, his mind racing, his soul vowing one thing above all. He would bring her back. He would cross the river if he had to battle the spirits themselves. Somewhere deep inside, Aiyana lifted her tear-streaked face to the sky. She didn't know why, but a small ember of hope flickered in her chest. The river had taken her, but it had not yet broken her. And far across the water, neither had Takoda. The river loomed wide and cruel beneath the pale afternoon sun, its surface glinting like 1,000 mocking eyes. Takoda crouched low behind a fallen cedar, his breathing shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. On the opposite bank, the traders dragged Aiyana from the canoe and tethered her like livestock to a crooked pole near their campfire. She stumbled but did not fall, her back straight despite the weight of fear pressing against her. Takoda's fingers dug into the mossy bark until his nails split. Every fiber of his being screamed to rush across the water, to tear through the camp and rip the bindings from Aiyana's wrists. But even from this distance, he could see the glint of knives, the cold efficiency with which the men moved. They were no careless wanderers. They were hardened survivors, trained to spot weakness and crush it. Takoda knew he would get one chance, and only one. The river was not just water. It was a barrier of time and breath, a deadly line he would have to cross unseen. He watched as Aiyana sat motionless by the fire, her gaze fixed on the flames, refusing to meet the eyes of her captors. She looked small, a pale figure wrapped in a too thin deerskin cloak, but her spirit burned bright enough for Takoda to see it across the raging water. She was not broken, not yet. Takoda pressed his forehead to the ground, the earth cool against his sweat-slicked skin, and whispered an ancient prayer his grandmother had taught him, not for safety, not for strength, but for cleverness, for the wisdom of the fox and the patience of the owl. He rose and turned away from the river's edge, moving deeper into the woods where the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp leaves. He would build a raft, flimsy enough to float but silent enough not to draw attention. He would wait for the moon to rise high and the traders to grow careless with full bellies and heavy eyelids. He would become the river's own shadow. Across the campfire, Aiyana closed her eyes, feeling the first fingers of night curl around her. She did not know the boy hid among the trees, plotting her rescue. But somewhere inside her battered heart, she dared to believe that the river could still bring something back. something stronger than sorrow, something named hope. Under the velvet hush of twilight, Takoda worked like a spirit possessed. His fingers, scraped and bleeding, wove saplings and river reeds into a makeshift raft, each knot a vow whispered into the night. Above him, the stars blinked awake, distant but watchful, as if the ancestors themselves leaned closer to witness his quiet rebellion. Every sound from the trader's camp across the river made his muscles tense. The crackle of firewood, the muttered grunts of men settling down, the occasional sharp bark of laughter. He knew the minutes were slipping away like sand between his fingers. Dawn would bring movement, vigilance, and the final loss of Aiyana. He needed to move before then, to ride the dark river while the world slept. Takoda lashed one final length of vine across the frame of his raft, testing its strength with a brutal yank. It would barely hold his weight. It would creak and groan like a wounded animal. But it was all he had, and it would have to be enough. He dragged it to the water's edge, every step a battle against fear. He had never crossed the river at night. He had never fought its unseen currents without a canoe. He had never risked everything for anything. Until now. Until her. He slipped into the icy water, teeth chattering, pushing the raft ahead of him as he swam with slow, careful strokes. The river closed around him like a living thing, tugging, pulling, whispering threats into his ears. But Takoda thought only of Aiyana, of the way her smile used to light up their games in the meadow, of the soft defiance that still clung to her even now. Halfway across, a piece of driftwood slammed against his shoulder, spinning him sideways. He gasped, nearly losing the raft, nearly surrendering to the hungry current. But he gritted his teeth, blinked the river from his eyes, and pushed onward, inch by painful inch, breath by ragged breath. When at last he touched the far bank, hidden by a curtain of reeds, Takoda collapsed into the mud, chest heaving, muscles trembling. Across the thinning shadows, the trader's campfire flickered low, the guards dozing with their weapons laid carelessly by their sides. He had crossed the river. Against every warning, against every reason, he had made it. Now came the hardest part, stealing Aiyana back without waking the wolves. The ground was soft and treacherous beneath Takoda's feet as he crept through the tangled underbrush, each step a prayer against the snap of a twig or the rustle of a leaf. The traders lay sprawled in a loose ring around the dying fire, their bodies slack with exhaustion. But Takoda knew better than to trust sleep as deep. Hunters learned to wake with the slightest sound. One wrong move, one stumble, and Aiyana would be lost to him forever. He tightened his grip on the stone knife tucked into his belt, not for blood, but for the ropes that bound her. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure the whole camp could hear it, a frantic drumbeat marking each inch of dangerous ground he crossed. Aiyana sat motionless against the post, her head bowed, her arms slack. For one terrible moment, fear froze him. What if they had hurt her, silenced her spirit? But then, as if she had felt him draw near, her head lifted slightly, and her dark eyes locked onto his. Hope flared so bright in her gaze that it almost broke him. Takoda dropped low, crawling the last few feet like a snake through the grass. His fingers found the rough cord around her wrists and began sawing it with desperate, careful motions. Aiyana stayed still, barely breathing, though her whole body trembled with the nearness of freedom. The final strand of rope gave way with a soft snap, and Takoda caught her hand before she could stumble. He pointed toward the river with a tilt of his chin, and together they melted back into the shadows. But the river was farther now than it had ever seemed. Every step away from the campfire felt like an eternity, every whisper of the breeze like a trader's breath at their necks. Takoda kept his body between Aiyana and the camp, shielding her, his every sense straining for the sound of pursuit. When they reached the edge of the reeds where his battered raft waited, Takoda helped her climb aboard, the raft dipping precariously under their combined weight. Aiyana's fingers gripped his wrist in silent terror as Takoda pushed them into the current, his whole being focused on the black ribbon of water ahead. Behind them, a low shout split the night air. Someone had woken. Someone had seen. The chase had begun, but Takoda had already made one impossible crossing. He would not fail her now. The river was no longer a whispering friend. It was a roaring beast, thrashing and snarling beneath the raft as Takoda fought to keep them afloat. Behind them, torches flared to life on the far bank, angry yells cutting through the night like knives. Aiyana crouched low, clutching the raft's edge, her wide eyes flashing with terror as arrows hissed through the air, missing by heartbeats and inches. Takoda's muscles burned as he plunged a broken branch into the water, using it like a crude paddle, pushing them deeper into the swiftest part of the current. He knew it was a gamble. The river was stronger there, more unpredictable. It could tear them apart as easily as it could carry them to safety, but it was their only chance. The traders were scrambling into their canoes now, shouting at each other, slapping at the water in their haste. Takoda gritted his teeth and drove the raft onward, feeling it shudder and groan beneath him. Every heartbeat was a battle. Every breath was a victory stolen from the river's grasp. Aiyana leaned close, her voice barely a whisper over the chaos. "They're coming," she said, and he could hear the terror she fought so hard to hide. Takoda didn't answer. He didn't dare look back. The river bent sharply ahead, swirling into a vicious whirlpool ringed with broken branches and hidden rocks. It was death for anyone foolish enough to be caught in it. Takoda made a split-second decision. He shoved the branch deeper, steering hard left, aiming for the narrow channel between the whirlpool and the jagged stones. The raft skidded sideways, water spilling over them, soaking their clothes, stealing their breath. For one dizzy moment, it felt like they would capsize. Then, with a violent jerk, they shot free, riding the current like a flung arrow. Behind them, the first trader's canoe wasn't so lucky. It slammed into the whirlpool's grip, spinning helplessly before capsizing, throwing its riders into the churning black water. Shouts turned to screams. Takoda didn't allow himself even a heartbeat of triumph. He kept pushing, driving the raft toward the dark line of trees on the opposite bank, their home shore. Freedom. Aiyana's hand found his in the darkness, squeezing once, fierce and grateful. Together, soaked, shivering, and breathless, they rode the river's fury, not as captives, not as victims, but as warriors of their own fate. The raft scraped against the muddy bank with a sound like a wounded cry, and Takoda didn't wait. He leapt into the shallows, half dragging, half carrying Aiyana onto the solid ground, the cold mud sucking at their legs as if trying to pull them back into the river's grasp. For a fleeting heartbeat, they both stood gasping, soaked and shivering, the forest looming before them like a wall of black teeth. But there was no time to rest. Across the water, the remaining traders roared in fury, their torches bobbing wildly as they regrouped. They would not abandon the hunt. They would not forgive a stolen prize. Takoda grabbed Aiyana's hand and plunged into the trees, weaving through the gnarled trunks and tangled undergrowth. Thorns tore at their skin, branches clawed at their clothes. But Takoda didn't slow. He knew these woods better than any map or mark. He had grown up within their living maze, learning every game trail and hidden hollow. Yet tonight, the familiar paths felt like traps. Every snapped twig behind them a warning that death followed close. Aiyana stumbled once, twice, her breath hitching in exhausted gasps. But she never let go of his hand. Somewhere deep in the night, a hunting horn blew, low and terrible. Takoda flinched. That sound meant they had loosed the dogs, lean, merciless beasts trained to chase down anything that ran. He yanked Aiyana behind a fallen log and pressed her flat against the earth. His mind raced. They couldn't outrun the dogs forever. They needed a place to hide, a way to lose their scent. A trick clever enough to fool even nature's finest hunters. The creek. It ran not far from here, winding through the forest like a silver thread. If they reached it, if they walked through the water, maybe, just maybe, they could throw the dogs off their trail. Takoda leaned close, his forehead touching Aiyana's for a moment, steadying them both. Then he rose and pulled her to her feet again, guiding her with silent urgency toward salvation. Behind them, The traders shouted, the dogs baying louder with each heartbeat. The forest, once their friend, now seemed to push against them with every step. But Takoda's will burned hotter than any fear. He had crossed the river. He had stolen her back. He would not lose her now, not to men, not to beasts, not even to the dark itself. The night clutched at them with icy fingers as Takoda and Aiyana stumbled through the tangled woods, every step a battle against exhaustion and fear. The howls of the dogs grew sharper, nearer, snapping at their heels like living curses. Takoda's legs burned with every stride, but he dared not slow. In the distance, a shimmer of silver caught the moonlight. The creek, narrow and winding, its waters whispering salvation. "There," he rasped, his voice nearly broken from running, from praying. Aiyana nodded, too winded to speak, but her eyes blazed with the same stubborn fire that had carried her through the trader's cruelty. Takoda led her down the steep embankment, slipping and sliding on wet stones, not caring about the scrapes that tore at his skin. They plunged into the creek without hesitation, the icy water biting deep into their bones. Takoda grabbed Aiyana's hand tightly and waded upstream, forcing themselves against the current, their footprints vanishing beneath the swirling water. The creek bed was a treacherous maze of slick stones and hidden roots, and twice Aiyana stumbled, her body trembling with exhaustion. Each time Takoda caught her, whispered fierce encouragement, and dragged her onward. Behind them, the dogs' howls grew confused, circling, scattering, searching. The water was working, masking their scent, but it was a fragile, temporary shield. They needed more distance. They needed a miracle. As they rounded a bend, Takoda spotted a fallen tree arched low across the creek, its trunk split and hollowed by age. Without thinking, he boosted Aiyana into the shelter of its broken heart, squeezing in beside her, curling their bodies into the smallest spaces they could find. The river rushed past them, loud enough to mask the hammering of their hearts. They lay there, soaked and shivering, as shadows moved along the banks above them. Dark figures and snarling beasts, so close Takoda could see the torchlight glinting off their sharpened blades. Aiyana's fingers gripped his shirt, clutching him like a lifeline, and Takoda wrapped his arm around her, anchoring them both to this fragile sliver of hope. Minutes dragged into an eternity. Then, slowly, the hunters moved on, their curses fading into the deeper forest. Takoda didn't move, didn't breathe, not until he was sure the night had swallowed their enemies whole. Only then did he dare believe that, against all odds, they had survived one more death's breath. The first pale fingers of dawn brushed the treetops with gold as Takoda and Aiyana crawled from the hollowed tree, their bodies stiff and aching from the night's brutal escape. The forest looked different in the newborn light, softer somehow. The terrible hunt reduced to nothing but broken twigs and fading tracks in the mud. Takoda rose slowly, every muscle screaming, but he knew they had no time to waste. He offered Aiyana his hand, and she took it without hesitation, her palm cold, but her grip steady. Together they limped along the creek's edge, following the water deeper into the woods, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the memory of snarling dogs and shouting men. The world was quiet now, save for the soft murmur of the creek and the distant songs of waking birds. Freedom, Takoda realized, did not come with the clash of swords or the roar of triumph. It came like this, silent, trembling, stitched together from pain and hope and sheer stubborn will. Aiyana stumbled on a root and fell to her knees with a sharp cry. Takoda dropped beside her instantly, his hands gentle as he helped her sit back against a tree. Tears welled in her eyes, not just from pain, but from the weight of everything she had carried. The betrayal, the terror, the long, desperate flight. For the first time since the nightmare began, she allowed herself to weep. Takoda sat beside her, silent, offering the only thing he had left, his presence, his loyalty, his unspoken promise that she would never face the world alone again. When her sobs quieted, Aiyana lifted her head and looked at him, really looked at him, and what passed between them needed no words. Gratitude, trust, a bond forged in the crucible of fear and fire. Takoda reached into the pouch tight at his waist and pulled out a small object, a strip of leather he had braided long ago, a simple token of their childhood games and whispered promises. He tied it gently around her wrist, his fingers shaking with exhaustion and emotion. Aiyana touched the braid with trembling hands, and for the first time in days, a small, broken smile curved her lips. They were not home yet. They were not safe yet. But in that quiet golden dawn, sitting side by side on the damp earth, they had claimed something no river, no dogs, no men could ever take away again. The first light of freedom. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of mist as Takoda and Aiyana made their slow way through the deep woods, following old deer trails and forgotten footpaths. Every step pulled at their raw muscles and scraped skin, but neither of them spoke of stopping. Ahead of them, beyond the rising hills and whispering trees, lay home, the village where they had once laughed under the summer stars, where their mother's songs had floated over the cornfields, where a daughter had been traded away and a boy had dared to steal her back. As they crested the final ridge, the village came into view, a cluster of smoke-wreathed lodges and narrow fields shimmering in the noon light. But it did not welcome them. Figures gathered near the council fire, the elders rising from their seats, the hunters abandoning their work. A low murmur rippled through the crowd as the two bedraggled figures stumbled into the clearing. Takoda with torn buckskins and bloody hands, Aiyana with swollen wrists and haunted eyes. Takoda's father stepped forward first, his face carved from stone, his mouth a grim line. The chief rose from his seat of honor, his expression unreadable, the weight of the people's judgment heavy in the silence. Aiyana's father stood at the edge of the gathering, eyes shadowed, shame bowing his shoulders. No one spoke. No one moved. Takoda pushed Aiyana gently forward until she stood alone before the council fire, her thin frame trembling but unbroken. She lifted her chin, her voice rising clear and strong over the stillness. "I am not a trade," she said. "I am not a burden to be passed away for sharpened stones." The chief's eyes narrowed, studying her, weighing the power in her words. Takoda stepped beside her, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I crossed the river," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "I faced their knives, their dogs, their anger. I brought her back because she belongs here, not as a price to be paid, but as a daughter, as a sister, as one of us." For a long moment, the village stood frozen in the balance between the old ways and the new. Then an elder woman stepped forward, laying a wrinkled hand on Aiyana's shoulder. Another woman followed, and another, until the circle mended itself around her, silent but whole. And in that moment, under the vast unblinking sky, Aiyana was no longer something traded or taken. She was home. The sun dipped low, staining the sky with crimson and gold as the village gathered for the evening fire, not in judgment now, but in silent reverence. Takoda and Aiyana sat side by side near the flames, their bruised bodies wrapped in new cloaks woven by the women who had once turned away, their heads bowed in quiet exhaustion and hard-won peace. Around them, the people moved with a different kind of respect, not born of fear or tradition, but of understanding. The old ways had been challenged, and though scars still marked the earth between them, something stronger had begun to root itself beneath the ash. Aiyana's father approached with slow, heavy steps, the lines of regret deep in his face. He knelt before her, the man who had once traded his daughter for tools, now offering nothing but his open hands. Aiyana looked at him for a long, long moment. The wound was deep, but she was not made of bitterness. She placed her small hand in his, not as a sign of forgetting, but as a signal that healing had begun. Across the fire, Takoda met his father's gaze. There was no anger there, no punishment, only the silent acknowledgement between men who had both been changed by the boy's courage. Later, when the stars stitched themselves into the night sky and the drums began to speak low songs of endurance and hope, Aiyana and Takoda stood together at the river's edge. The same river that had torn them apart, the same river they had dared to defy. The water flowed gently now, reflecting the shimmering sky, a mirror of their journey. Aiyana tossed a strand of braided leather into the current, a symbol of the chains she had shed, a token to the spirits that had watched over them. Takoda placed a hand over his heart and whispered a vow not just to her, but to the future they would shape together. They had crossed the river, battled fear, survived betrayal, and returned stronger than anyone had believed possible. And though scars would remain, though memories would sometimes cut deeper than any blade, the river could no longer claim them. They were not victims of its tide. They were its challengers, its survivors. Under the endless eternal stars, Takoda and Aiyana turned from the water and walked back toward the firelight, not as lost children, not as broken offerings, but as a brother and sister of a new dawn.